There we go. Can you hear me now? Okay, my sound is not working. Let's see. Huh. Let's try this. Try that. Check, check. Can you hear now? Check, check. Great. Now let's try this one. Sound check again. How can I check mine? It's got to be a test thing. Here we go. Speak and pause, speak and pause. There we go. Check sound. Can you hear, Tom? I cannot hear you. Let's see. Where's the Brady Bunch type mode? Oh, maybe it's in that mode already.
Can you hear me now?
Now I got you.
Okay. I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, it could be a little funky. Mine's sometimes done the mute thing just out of the blue for some reason.
It was like I tested all the audio and stuff before before you got on, so that I would be ready to go. And
Yep, that's a familiar story. Hey, Marshall, how are you?
Pretty good. How you guys doing?
Doing okay.
good, man. Well, Marcy, you don't want to come to Albany now.
No, that's true. That's true. Y'all are all sick.
Just about. Jeez.
No, man, I'm trying to get this thing and get it over with.
I'm not, only because I have kids with breathing problems.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense. As for me, I think I could make it through it. Then I could tell people not to tell me where I can't go.
Well, one piece of advice I sort of heard was that I liked was to, treat it not as if you were going to catch it, but as if you had it already.
Sure.
People, so changes the calculus a little bit.
I tried that, and my boss wouldn't take me calling in sick.
Yeah, well, there's that.
He told me right anyways.
Well, we're prepping so that if this thing bumps up again in the fall, all our classes can be done online there too. I don't want to do it because I'm course director for one of the classes and I prefer teaching face to face, but it's the world we're in for this year at least. So.
Yeah, making the transition to online was really tough for me. I had to change nothing.
Yes, Wendy's in the same boat. She worked remotely anyway.
It's like the only thing I had to do is like learn to deal with more people in the house when I'm working.
Yeah.
Sure.
I got the Perrier painted red, although the red they gave me is a little more white than sort of a dark color. So I'm going to go back and have them retone it and cover it with a second coat.
So you used a red primer.
No, well, yeah, essentially, yes. Yes. A lightish red primer, which is not what I wanted. So it's all right. We've got Liz and Daniel now. That's good.
Awesome.
Hola. Oh, he's not down yet. So. Hola, Daniel and Liz. How are you?
Hi,
There she is. How are you?
I'm good, fine.
Taking
Thanks.
a break from the weekend, from the project?
Yeah, too much studying for a while.
Yeah.
So I study it's fun to read other material.
Yes. Yeah, I always find that jumping back and forth kind of strange. So,
Yeah. Or you know,
all right. Saddle soap is your friend.
Oh, is that what was going on? Okay.
Yeah, I got a bunch of my dad's stuff. He passed in 2012, and I found these in a box. Really nice pair of leather gloves, but they were, getting mold on them and stuff because they were out in the garage. It's like, oh well, now they're in pretty much primo shape. So.
I know from our perspective on the camera, it was just sounding really wrong.
That's probably true. Never believe what you see on camera. We have a couple more minutes. I think Marshall's got some folks.
Yeah, I'm hoping to scare them on here. That's how these things go, though. I'm gonna
Yes.
take a little bit of the credit for kind of changing the time up on everybody. I appreciate y'all being cool with that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I had some unhappy stuff to deal with, so it's not unique to you guys these days, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, no, it was definitely busy. We furloughed a bunch of people.
Yep.
And they, of course, since they were furloughing people from the IT department as well, they didn't tell us until right beforehand. So.
Yeah, it's usually that for IT, come back from lunch on Friday and you're locked out. So.
Right.
Never a good sign when you try to log in and you can't get in after lunch.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. That's why whenever any of my logins don't work, I start getting panicky.
Sure.
Like, hey, why isn't this working?
sorry, I got a call from Sweden.
Did you? No problem.
My often call
Oh,
them.
good. That takes
Absolutely.
precedence, Liz. Definitely.
Yeah, you have to consider the time difference. So
Right.
it's a limited window of communication.
Sure. Everything good at home?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. Good.
They're doing great.
Okay. All right. Yay. That's something preserved. That's good. It's good to do on your strapping, by the way, also for your armor, saddle soap and mink oil and such, or neat's foot oil if your leather's getting crinkly.
I resemble that remark.
I don't know what the effect of neat's foot oil would be on you, Tom. That's up to you to figure out.
Don't judge.
Hey, Daniel, can you hear us out there? Maybe.
There we go.
There he is. Gotcha. See you now, Daniel.
Okay, I'm gonna log into the computer. I'm just testing the cell phone and see how it worked out.
Sure.
But,
I have to do that at some point too.
okay. It says the meeting host will let you in soon.
Oh, I suppose I'll let you in then. There you go. There you go.
Okay.
Looks like we may have Sam too. That's good.
All right.
There it is.
Hello, Sam. Can you hear? Oh, well, that would do it, right? I didn't realize it wasn't even on. Okay,
Zach's about to get on too.
there we go. I hear fella, I think. So. Zach's on.
Just to make Brian envious.
Oh, yeah, thanks very much. That's great.
It's only fair. You have plenty of other books I'm envious over. So
I have a few of those. I was ecstatic when I found a hardcover of Keen because they weren't available at all for a long time. Then you go and find the folio edition. Oh, okay. Okay.
at a ridiculous price.
Yeah, really good price. That's true. I actually considered taking the hardcover down and having a leather binder do a job on it, but these days that's a couple $100. That's more than, that's a luxury at this point. Many other things that money can be put into. Hey, Sam, can you hear us over there? Hey, Sam, can you hear us? Maybe. That would be, oh, the cat interference. Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Apparently, she wants to be part of the discussion.
Apparently. This is the color the barrier was supposed to be, a nice classic red. They didn't make that color. They made like a salmony red. Back to Lowe's. The other problem is now the barrier is going to sit here for how long until we use it? Probably be Liz that gets to try it first. I'll have to put Liz in one of my helmets so she can try the poleaxe. See, I figure if I get her in a full harness and she has so much fun, she'll be stuck and she'll have to acquire her own. So
that's a risk.
not for me, just for you.
Yeah, it'll be expensive. I haven't ordered the sword yet, so I have a sum to spend on something.
I like where that's going. It is a very HEMA thing, though, to spend like $1,200 on a sword and then get a $200 fencing helmet to fight in.
Yeah, it is.
Whereas the Deeds of Arms people go the other way. They get a $7,000 harness and then, you know, a stick. So,
well, it's good to invest in the helmet.
I think so. Helmet and hands. Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't get a lightweight helmet. Heavy on the head is actually good, especially for things like poleaxes.
And it doesn't really matter if it weighs more, because if you have a good elefante, then
yeah,
you're
should be able to move it. There were some guys trying to make titanium helmets for a while. It's just a very silly idea because they don't weigh enough and it's going to transmit directly to your head. So might work okay with the HEMA, the lighter HEMA weapons, but not with the full out poleaxe and stuff.
that would be devastating.
All right, well, we've got, you know, we could call, I guess, a quorum people here. Marshall, are you expecting anyone else?
No, Ray was the only other one, and he got called into work, so he's going to watch the recording.
Sure, no sweat. It is recording, of course. I don't have any slides prepped for this one because it's just more of a discussion-y seminar thing.
Sure.
The way these things normally work is we'll kick out an observation or question about the reading, and then we'll cooperatively go back and forth. We'll see how the flow works in a seminar environment, but it should work fine. Mostly, we're not going to run it like raise your hand and we'll call on you, but we'll try to, if there's a number of people waiting, I'll try to queue people up and let them know. But the only caveat here can be you can get a lot of noise. If you're muted and you hit the space bar, it works like a push to talk on a walkie-talkie. So it's a nice little feature. You just push, talk, and then let go when you're done. And it keeps things kind of even. So we can maybe try that. So first thing I like to do on these normally is just get the impressions on the reading. So we probably start with Keen. Not a lot of pages here, but it does, I think, pretty nicely introduce what we're going to be talking about here over the next little while. So what were your thoughts, plus and minus, and how hard was it? How valuable was it?
Pretty valuable. It wasn't really hard read. You know, maybe.
No, these first couple of chapters aren't hard.
Trying to read late at night when you're tired is the most conducive. So it helped. It helped better than melatonin.
Keen is pretty much, you know, high-end historical writing stuff. So he didn't win any awards for this book, which is a little bizarre, given how foundational it really is. There's a whole big school of academics who basically follow the Keen approach. In fact, I just reviewed another one, this one, A Companion of Chivalry. It's probably backwards in your camera, but it's a whole bunch of the writers who have followed on with Keen's ideas. And so he sort of establishes a school of thought that talks about chivalry as sort of an international set of ideas that takes off. And he's the first one to really call it sort of an international thing. And in a way that's early because we don't really have nations yet when this starts, but The idea that someone in, the German-speaking territories would understand it very similarly to how you might get it in France or in Britain is kind of an amazing thing. Italy is always a special case, and usually in most things historical, England's a special case too, but not in this. That's very typical. So what he's trying to do here is kind of introduce his overall ideas, and he's been amazingly influential. Probably the #1 scholar on this. And even people who violently disagree with him would give him the chops for that, regardless. So he picks up where some other scholars have left off. And the good thing about him is if you understand and you read through Keen, then when you get something else, you can fit it, where it fits. And there's another school of thought, the Chivalry and Violence School. This one by Richard Kuiper. Excellent book, fantastic scholar. He's always been very nice to me, fine fellow. And I'm close with some of his students. He's of the idea that the primary issue was violence, whereas Keen's focused on the ideas, not the ideal, but the idea of chivalry, and what that really means. So what jumps out at you in the early part of this?
I mean, I'm trying not to mix it up because I thought we were reading chapter 1 and 2. So
that's fine. 1
but
and
I
2
think
is fine.
chapter 1 was just, he's just kind of setting up like the sources that he's going to use. So I think this chapter was just really like dealing with his framework. That's kind of how I read it.
Yeah, that's fair. Framework and to some degree the historiography. So the way the debate had gone prior to the point when he wrote this in the mid-'80s. At that time, there was a new idea hitting the military history community, which is called the New Military History. There's a book, The Face of Battle, some of you have read it. And that book really was trying to get at it, not from the king's and prince's point of view, but from what the soldier was actually feeling. There's a chapter in there on Agincourt. But it's very much imagined because there aren't a lot of soldierized views that he can draw from. And it's a good book and it's an interesting read, but Keen was writing sort of in that era, trying to capture a little of that. So the ideas are what's going on, what motivates people, that's part of what he's talking about here. And so he'll build that out. As Marshall says, he'll talk about his sources. So what's he relying on for sources?
Fair bit of romance.
Yeah. Why is that valid though? That's true, definitely. Romance, of course, here defined as chivalric stories rather than, novels with Fabio on the front.
Spottish Rivers.
Yeah, that is where they come from.
That's really the only written accounts that's really left. There's really no biographies or historical accounts other than these romances, right?
Not quite. There are romances. There are some biographies. There's ones from, there's a Song of the Black Prince. There's the your own Petro Nino. That one survives. Those are in sort of a romance. They echo romance would be a good way to put it. The Bosco text and things of that sort. So they're romance-ish. Now, the history discipline was set up by Herodotus and Thucydides long ago. The idea that you're using sources to put them together to try to capture the essence of what was going on at a time. And the romances medievally are one of the biggest surviving sources, but there are other things too. There are inventory records, there are knightly handbooks, things of that sort. Those survive as well. There's also art, display art. So stained glass windows, illuminations, other kinds of illustrations, paintings, things of that sort. So there are other sources to some degree. And of course, we work a lot with the surviving artifacts, the arms and armor that survive and how they might have been used from an experimental archaeology point of view. But that's not what he's doing. Of course, he's going back to these romances. A quick challenge can come up on the romances that they're just, fanciful stories. They didn't have much to do with real life chivalry. So why would we start there?
I guess the Avengers is purely fiction, but somebody, 1,000 years from now could watch our popular movies and maybe get a sense of our values. And I think that's how he's using it. Yeah,
totally. Avengers is a really good parallel, I think. I used to use Star Wars for the same thing, but maybe that's fallen off the bus a little bit. But the Avengers might be a more current example. Certainly the first three Star Wars are more like a King Arthurian sort of thing, as is Avengers. So.
Well, so too, the Vikings TV show launched an entire subculture of Viking stuff. People have completely re-energized that clothing styles, preposterous looking, not what real Vikings would look like, but it completely shifted the landscape. Romances are effectively the TV shows of the medieval period. It's what they did to entertain themselves.
Yeah, and
It's
there's
idealized.
go for it.
I said it's also an idealized form of what chivalry and knighthood should be, even if it's not quite what it is. It was aspirational.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the. I mean, any ideology, right, is aspirational because there's no perfect person. But the Arthurian mythos, in particular, gives you archetypes that people weave back to, which is why both Star Wars and the Avengers are good analogs for now, that they map back. You know, who's the Darth Vader in the story, who's the Luke in the story, etc. Parts of all might be Luke, you know, for example. This is a potent idea, not only in the West, although it's very much a Western thing. Other cultures have sort of vaguely similar things. But this is very much what they idealized. The other thing that's less appreciated is, to some degree, their teaching texts, because you're given either challenges of loyalty or problems, and then how the heroes solve or fail to solve those problems is supposed to be something of a lesson. So you see this clearly in Mallory, but in some of the other tales, you'll see it woven in too. Not only from the moral point of view, just from the practical standpoint, you know, what's supposed to be happening here. So that this is where Keen wrestles with a really complicated and difficult thing, the nexus of ideology and reality. What's real and versus what's the role of an idea, and he's careful to call it an idea, not an ideal. And I think that's important, because I think by idea, he's saying that it actually did have a significant influence on people's behavior. How does that idea strike you?
Makes sense.
There's some weaknesses in that idea, though.
Well, certainly from the perspective that, you know, a lot of romances drove tournament life, and that drove a lot of the pomp and circumstance of tournament, which got away from the martial aspects of knighthood. But it did add flavor and color, but it lends itself to the idea of the whole series of the Indian summer of chivalry in the late period, and that chivalry never was only ever trappings and things like that, because they see these guys recreating romantic images, right? Their favorite TV shows, right? Their favorite stories. And they say, well, that's all that ever was. When in reality, it goes a lot deeper than that. This was just kind of, as Tom said, that ideal kind of vision of what it might be, told by people who were not necessarily knights necessarily, like Mallory was. Spent most of his later life in jail for, you know, beating up churchmen. But most romance writers were not knights or nobles of any kind, and so they were also just looking in at what they saw and writing about it versus necessarily being active participants.
Yeah, there's another book, I've got it back here, that introduces this. It's earlier than Keen, but it kind of talked about the same lines. Where did it go? And of course, it's not where it belongs. It's a book by Sidney Painter, and it's called French Chivalry. Here it is. Here's my copy, but this thing. And in French Chivalry, he talks about three major influences on the sort of chivalric community. The first, of course, were the warriors themselves. So what they thought about things, their customary practice. The law of arms, of course, was not really written down, but as you'll find later in Keen, it resided rather in the heads of the most renowned knights and men-at-arms of the era. So from their own ranks, they take some of the influences. The second big influence is, of course, the church. It has a lot to say about this, and a lot of the writers were, in fact, clerical. And as Keen points out, that's one influence, but it's not the only one. But it was a leavening influence to some degree on the warrior idea. And then the third one would have come from the softening of the court. Some have said the German courts and then the courts around Charlemagne. Others have said the ladies at court. Certainly there's an influence of courtly love and so on going in here too, and a softening of the idea. And you get Gawain as an archetype where he's going out and basically sleeping with every woman he can, whether she's willing or not, on one hand, versus a Parzival on the other hand. And so these are very different archetypes, and their champions are made by very different kinds of writers. And really what Keen would say that Painter said before him, and this is actually a pretty good intro for some folks. This is the Painter book. You can see it. But it's a really good sort of breakout. Keen does not break it out into such a clear triad. He's much more sophisticated than that, but he's still using that in some ways as a base. You'll see it if you squint a little bit as you go through here, where he's talking about the ideal version, and those three influences come in, and he'll look at sources from all three of those influences as well as some others. What he doesn't discuss much is influence, say, from the town, from the city. And there are some back and forth images there, and some of that's pretty important because that gives rise probably to the fighting treatises, more than just purely what we're talking about in Keen. But we'll weave that in as we go, just as a convenient thing. So he talks about three orders or estates in there. Is that familiar to you guys? Three orders?
Yes, certainly. Right. This harkens back to the old high school history class, right?
If they're still teaching it, yeah. I don't know what they're teaching now.
The three orders being military, clerical, and scholar?
No, military, clerical, and what's the third one? That's the worker, right? It's the serf. Serf is too simple because serfdom was not what we think it is really, but there were serfs, but it wasn't as dominant as it makes out to be. But certainly those who work the land. So it's those who work, those who pray, and those who fight. So in Latin, the bellatores fight, the clerics do the praying, and the labores do the working. And the idea for them is it's kind of like a social contract. So, each side provides for and protects the other two with what they do. It's an ideal version, to be sure. And there was not a lot of, it was something of a caste system. So there wasn't a lot of mobility in the ideal. Of course, in practice, there was movement at the edges, at least between them. Certainly more between the clergy and the nobility. And they tended to view it not as classes. That's really more of a 19th century, almost a Marxist way of looking at it. They looked at it more of in terms of orders. They called it the three orders. And there was a theological theory that the king's body was essentially, so the heart was the church, the head was supposed to be the king, and the hands were the people. And so this is kind of how they viewed society, as what they would call corporate, right? Coming from body. So sort of body of society. And it's a very different view than we often get now, because we're very much taught that things are based on classes and this conflict between classes and so on. That's very different than they seem to see it. Now, that's not always true. There were, of course, peasant revolts and so on as well. But that doesn't seem to be a dominant theme in the era. Becomes more of an issue at the end of the 100 Years' War, because the taxation and the privations of war were so challenging that the system, such as it was, shatters. The other thing that shattered it was, of course, the rise of the cities change all this. So it's going to be a very different set of things. This is a pastoral ideal. It's not actually, you can always find exceptions, and it didn't hold 100%, but it probably held, 70, 75%. And you can see similar things all the way from Germany up to Britain and Ireland and down into northern Italy and over into Spain. So quite a large area sort of followed this. There's a whole nother challenge of feudalism, which we can discuss or not. But so how does the three order thing strike you compared to? A little different ideal than we're used to using.
I don't know. Sometimes I think it's still relevant.
How's that?
Well, I mean, you have the political elite, you have the average middle class, and then you have military. So, I mean, now the span of what is the average worker has a much broader range than what it would have in the medieval period. But you have those that fight, you have those that work from day to day, and you have those that seemingly have privilege beyond what we would initially want them to. So I mean, it does kind of mirror today if you think about it.
We kind of like accept the idea, or we have an ideal, I guess, that there's like a great deal of mobility though between our classes, or there's not. Like, that's kind of like, and it seems like they uh, felt more locked in and thought that was legitimate than we do.
Yeah, and that's kind of what a caste means, that you're kind of closer to being locked in. Doesn't mean that it's completely immobile, but certainly we're far more mobile. I'd agree with that. It's interesting, Sam, you bring up the military piece, because of course the military segment's a much smaller segment of society, but it might have been rough. I mean, there weren't a lot of people percentage-wise even then doing this. You didn't have the big call-ups that you had until you have the early modern period. So that being said, lots of people end up being combatants. They're not actually in that group. If people are running over your villages, you have only a finite number of choices. So, any other similarities or differences? I like those so far.
I love the idea of getting out of your caste or your class, winning knighthood, bravery in battle, the upward mobility in today's society, which is financial.
Sure. You get a really famous example, which Keen will deal with a little bit, and that's William Marshall, who was, not of peasant stock or anything, but he was second son, wasn't ordained to inherit anything. And through his tournament reputation first, and this is in the time of Richard I, so Third Crusade, through his tournament and war prowess, he elevates his renown to the point where he's counselor to the king. He actually becomes an earl based on that. Not just because the crown decides that you're a good fighter and moves you in there, but he impressed his peers essentially. And so Marshall is in some ways a sort of prototype for a lot of that went on after him. And of course, right after the Marshall comes the Magna Carta, at the start of English constitutionalism. So an interesting overlay of times there. Marshall stuff is preserved in the Song of William Marshall, one of those biographies. And it's been translated in the last, 15 years as a 3-part thing in English. It's very hard to get, but I do have it. And it's amazing. It reads like a romance, but it also talks about everything that he did to try and build up his renown. And renown is really that social capital that they used to move into the knightly sort of area. During the 100 Years' War, they started to promote a whole different kind of guys they had less of the chivalric thing and no aristocracy really, but they were competent in battle. Now you can argue, and one of the things I'm wrestling with from a novel point of view is how that injection of a different kind of folks changes kind of the perspective of what's going on. France resisted initially, but then they too, as the war goes on, Bertrand de Guesclin and people like that begin to change over what they're doing to the point where you have Joan of Arc leading, for the siege of Orleans, which would never have happened early in the war. That's a change wrought by 100 years of war. People are willing to change things. The financial and social stresses are immense. And things are shifting economically around that era. So that's also coming into play here. But yeah, there is mobility. And one of the things we don't really recreate is the caste aspect of the thing. Even when we're doing the tournament companies, we basically left it open to, we don't restrict which religions can join. We don't do it by gender. If you want to come in and fight, that's fine. But chivalry has always been pretty adaptable in that regard. You can take the core ideas and fit it. Because when it starts out in the Song of Roland era, early on, that's not the same as what you're talking about by the 15th century. And the Duke of Burgundy is creating an artillery train to go down and overrun these old fortifications in Italy. That whole span is what we're talking about. This ginormous difference. But you can still recognize it at the beginning and at the end, is what Keen's saying here. So I think it'll be interesting. This introduction section, I think, is excellent just for the different problem. So he's trying to establish something of a definition of chivalry. How does he end up defining it? And is that satisfactory?
he puts it in a time period. He loosely says that it's indivorceable from the aristocracy, and then like he says he's kind of self-conscious about that in ways. And I think he also, I mean, of course, he associates it with like the professional horse soldier.
Mhm. Yeah, that comes from the Latin malite, which meant initially just horseman. And of course, I think he gives a little bit of the etymology of the word chevalerie, which cheval in French is horse. So these are the horsemen. It's equally as clear in Spanish, right, with the caballeros. So we even think of cabal now, and that's still in English. A cabal was kind of a bandit group. So these milites were not initially associated with an ideal. They were associated with being an elite cavalry force, essentially, or having the access to a horse, which changed. And this goes all the way back to the chariot warriors in Sumeria and Babylon and so on, and in Egypt, where the Sumerians were this elite group of aristocracy, owned their own chariots, provided military prowess to the crown or the emperor. So this idea is not new with Europe. It's sort of just the latest iteration if you're looking at sort of the Song of Roland, Carolingian era going through. So it is tied to that, definitely. And yet people have, they don't have any problems talking about chivalry on the field when people are fighting on foot with axes. Still chivalry, even though there's no horses now. So it grows beyond the horse at some point. What else do we get out of that? Go for it, Tom.
I was just say historically, I mean, the wealthy have always been able to have better equipment, which gives them an edge in battle anyways. And it in a way, nothing's really changed. You look at, say, a modern reenactment company who's probably portraying the knight, the guy who can afford the kit.
Yeah,
so
isn't it?
Just that change.
Yeah. Although you might have somebody that's got a couple guys with a workshop who can produce stuff. This happened to us during the company signature because we had 5 armorers in the company. So armoring people up was not an issue. But even in a modern military sense, the ones with the treasure have the better toys. There's no doubt we have better toys. We're also vastly richer than all the other players, so we can afford to do that. Innovation plays a role here too, but I think that does carry over. Certainly, the purpose of armor on horseback is to actually provide protection. I mean, warriors are practical people. I would argue they don't opt for that stuff unless it works. So you don't put out all the money and go through all the effort to become competent in it if it doesn't work, which is a military history argument you get all the time. Well, the horseman was never really dominant and armor didn't work. That's another set of debates, but one that he'll deal with a little bit later in the book, a little bit. So anything else in the definition? How would we define it today? It's kind of changed. Somebody else had something though.
I was going to say that in the first 2 chapters, Keen is, I guess, identifying some of the key definitions of chivalry, not just, someone that's armed, that has prowess in war, but who's loyal, servitude, generosity, largesse, and I guess charity. I mean, kind of, looking after ideally the helpless or the less fortunate.
Yeah, and he'll cite Raymond Lull for that, who laid it out in the clearest way that I've ever seen. There is no code of chivalry that existed. I mean, there's no, if you scoop online for 5 minutes, you'll find a dozen different iterations of that. We had one online for a while too, which was drawn from Lull, but that was more of a fuzzy set of ideals that all seem to have, for my money, some of these are common to warrior cultures generally, like prowess. That's pretty common, right? All warrior cultures seem to have that. Loyalty, pretty common for all warrior cultures because you've got this power and now you need to have some responsible way of exhibiting it. And then courage. Those all warrior cultures seem to have, there seems to be no difference on those. That doesn't distinguish chivalry at all because you could look at 16th century Bushido or the African warrior, and it's not different in those things. The other ones, though, are different. And this is where Sidney Painter's book is kind of cool, because he'll lay out where some of these come from and some of the other vectors. So what are some of the other ones other than prowess? What do we mean by that? First of all, before we do that, let's go back to these ideas. So what is prowess? And was it different then from how it is now?
Prowess is skill at arms.
Okay.
Not really any different in that regard.
Well, to us, I mean, to this crowd, yes.
Yeah.
But if you were to
That's-
expand that out to the broader civilian world, I don't think they would see it the same way. I mean, they might think being able to give a killer brief is good prowess, like making a good sale or whatever. I mean, it's much, but for our community, it certainly is your ability to take a blow and give a blow and fight with skill, which is, I don't think, a very common definition if you were to use that. Or they might just see it as physical fitness, right?
Well, the give and take a blow, I think, is an important thing, because that's in all one of the points of the joust is that you're not only giving the blow, you're trying to unhorse the other person, but you're taking their best and staying in the saddle. Crucial, absolutely crucial, which is why the ability to both gracefully and constitutionally take blows ends up being an issue. Now we're less about the Constitution just as a whole, although a satisfaction fight can be like that, but more, do you constitutionally and character-wise, do you take the blow too? So we have to morph it a little bit in some contexts. Obviously the ACL, BOTN, whatever you want to call those guys now, since there's 900 leagues, they're much more based on the constitutional aspect of it, the stand-up, fighting submission, as they like to call it, which is a part of medieval tourneying, but it's not the whole spectrum. But it's a piece of it. So then they do capture that piece. How about from how it manifests, prowess manifests on our fields, either in HEMA or in the deed of arms or whatever?
It's that sportsmanship aspect, the good sportsmanship, the compassionate, the fair play.
You might say that's generosity or respect, perhaps. Obviously, just pulling these out individually and having them stand alone is a little bit artificial, because they're all interwoven and they overlap some. So I wouldn't say that's wrong so much as it strikes me as more belonging to generosity. Certainly, we expect that of our combatants, and that manifested medievally too. But do you think there's any real differences now between prowess as we exhibit it in the Scola context and they might have expected it in history, in the medieval period, say, the broad thing, all the way up to the early modern period?
Well, I think there's certainly a level of extremity. They were much more extreme in how they fought. I mean, you hear stories of this town and this town, everything in between is game, including the towns, and we may or may not be using sharp weapons. We don't quite go about it quite so crazily. I mean, you might argue some of the Armored Combat League guys do, but I mean, we on average, people don't quite go that hard. And their expectation would be, you get stabbed, you get back up, you keep going, you heal up and move out. You stab one of us, that's probably going to be an end to the hobby for a good long while. So I mean, there's definitely on the extreme end, but I don't think in general there's a difference in the idea that we expect each other to get out there into the list. We expect each other to fight. You accept any challenge you're given. If somebody asks for for challengers, you typically will try and accept that challenge and give them a good fight. And I think that's much the same in a lot of ways that they would expect.
I think it's the difference between us and them is, for us, we're doing this as a hobby. It's a passion. It's something that we do, but it was a way of life for them. So of course, it made such a more difference. to getting the renown, it was by living this idea, the ideas that was present in their society. So, and if you're that involved, and that's that's how you shape your life, of course you are more into every fight and want to make a statement if you want to create the renown then.
Well, and two of you are professional officers serving today. So how do you see the mapping between your professional duties as an officer and the medieval idea of prowess?
Well, from an Army perspective, it's lead from the front. So, like, for instance, one of the first missions I ever went on as a lieutenant with my mortar platoon, we hopped out of the trucks and I took off, and I was 100% in the front, probably too much in the front, probably a little too gung-ho. And the platoon sergeant looked at me and was like, oh shit, and he freaking go. And they all came running after me. But the point is I was in front. I was accepting risk on myself. I was 100% out there demonstrating that I am in the poo with them. Now, I don't know that a medieval knight would care so much if he demonstrated that to an enlisted guy or to one of his soldiers, but certainly from our perspective, the ability in the Army to demonstrate that, you know, you are not fearful of combat, that you can get out there and do it, right, and that you are proficient and excel at it, is something that we strive to maintain and set an example of. So from the Army perspective.
Yeah, from the Swedish Air Force perspective, I totally agree with you. I was my introduction into the armed forces began as a conscript soldier. So I worked myself up from being a soldier to an officer, and I think it's vital to lead from the front, as you say, because if you set an example, then people follow you. So I made sure that I never expect from any of my subordinates something that I wouldn't do or couldn't do myself. And by having that knowledge, I could lead with confidence and also create a trust between myself and my soldiers. So I think that's very important. It looks a little bit different, but the basic ideas are the same.
Yeah, we might call that professional reputation now amongst your peers, and then there would be something else for the ones you lead. But it definitely, I do see it as parallel also. Certainly that seems, and you might call it in other fields, you might call it professionalism just by itself without the prowess or the military necessarily aspect of it. We certainly expect it. You know, Danny's teaching martial arts, so obviously it plays out there. You have to be the thing that you're doing. You have to get out in front. You can't instruct without actually demonstrating that competence, and more than competence, expertise or even mastery is what's sort of expected. So I don't see that's necessarily different. You know, Tom's writing, you got to demonstrate it there to your people that you're writing to and to the people who are evaluating your stuff. So I think it does map pretty nicely across, with the extra bit that, you know, there's the courage under fire is a little different than courage not under fire. And even though we train people up, you never really know how they're going to react until the bullets are flying, because it's just not the same. But nonetheless, you know, we do exchange blows back and forth with steel and plastic and wood and whatnot. So some of that is replicated. Obviously, I fought 2 fights with sharp steel just to do it with Robert Wood's end. I don't think I would do it now, but we did it then. And it just feels different. For one thing, the openings are much smaller. The swords are narrower. And that does play a role. But also, I would only do it with somebody whose concern was with their opponent's safety more than proving themselves against that opponent. But it did feel different than doing it even with verbated steel. So the analogy doesn't map exactly because he wasn't trying to kill me. Whereas somebody, you know, when those tracers go and start bouncing around you, that really changes the game a little bit. But not to say that people can't do this. We do have our own ways of testing. And I would argue that we test this to some degree in sparring, but also especially in tournaments. We test it because you're all on the line there. Your reputation, at least, is on the line there. And those other virtues, not so much loyalty, but courage, definitely shows up. So in a Scola context, because we could talk about courage under fire, but in a Scola context, how would courage manifest?
Fight Brian Johnson.
Okay, physical courage, yeah, definitely. He'll pick up the 20-pound boulder and drop it on your head. Yes. Well, that's something actually in the challenge format. One of the errants asked us at the second or third pot arms, I don't remember, should I challenge somebody I can beat or should I challenge someone else? And I said, I don't know, but my practice is always to challenge the hardest SOB on the other side. Because I think about it this way, if I lose, well, I challenge the hardest guy. Am I not actually losing? If I win, though, it's all upside. Whereas if I challenge somebody easy and I lose that fight, well, now I've just put myself below them in terms of prowess. Plus, I'm thought of a little bit as a coward for making the easy out. So I would tell them to challenge the most difficult guy out there. You might think about it differently. Not everybody necessarily thinks about the way I did, but that's how I sort of thought about that. So there is courage there to how you do it, but also to how if you challenge somebody in an elimination tournament, and by challenging that person, you give yourself an almost automatic loss. What does that do? And that's possible in some forms of tournament where you actually challenge in. And how you challenge in there matters. You get guys who are gaming the system to see if they can make it to the final bracket or whatever. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it plays out differently with the guy who's trying to fight every hard fight he can and still make it there. We had a fellow from Australia who would fight, if he received a bye in a tournament, an elimination tournament, he would go fight 2 pickups at least to make sure the fighting was even, because he didn't want it said that he won because he hadn't fought the same number of fights as everybody else. Whereas I can see, in round 7 or 8, you're like, oh, thank God, a bye. Yay. Try to recover. So different ways of thinking about courage. What other ways you guys think about it on the field? How else can it manifest? Yeah, fighting Brian Johnson, absolutely.
I mean, I don't like, I imagine there's like analogy. I mean, my experience is certainly more in like a HEMA competition.
Sure.
And we have people who like are kind of spooked at going at first or whatever, or like have anxiety. But I mean, like, like you have a lot of people watching you, and you have people that are going to try to hit you, and it's scary. And like to a degree, I mean, like kind of walking that plank, something that I hope people aspire to do along like courageous lines.
I don't think that aspect of courage is different. I think all tournaments have that, and I agree. The HEMA ones have it too, just like a regular, just like a deed of arms would have it. There is putting yourself out on the line. People are watching, and they're assessing. That's where your renown or infamy comes from. It's from that assessment. In a professional context, we get it from the stuff we do every day at work, right? All the interactions, all the things that we execute, it all comes from that. But tournaments are a special place. It's a stage, if you will. No matter whether it's a deed of arms or a HEMA tournament, it's still a stage. And people are watching. So that's another way it evinces. I give a third way, calling blows. You really want to win that fight, but maybe that was good, maybe not. So that's always a tough one because you don't really know where your motivation comes from. So I try to make it the practice just to give the benefit of the doubt to my opponent regardless, as a guard against that. It's just the way I deal with it. There's other ways. This might come up even in a judge context. You think you hit him. The judges don't think so. How you deal with that is interesting. There's all kinds of body language things. There's stuff you could say or not say. There are all sorts of interactions you could set up, but it matters because how you play that is going to affect the reputation, I think, going forward. Hey, Daniel, how about from your perspective on this one? You see this all the time.
Yeah, I mean, well, with the Asian martial arts, humility and respect are huge. Whereas I think maybe with the Western martial arts scene, yes, there is respect, but I think it is not as, I don't know if so much stress is not placed on individual respect. I don't know. It just seems like the martial arts, the Korean martial arts and the Asian martial arts, it's always, you stay silent. And if there's something, you accept it. Versus, more of a Western culture is like, hey, I'm going to stand up for what I think is right. So it's less individualistic.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. That being said, right, there's different ways to handle it in both realms. I don't know. I've seen maybe 6 or 8 HEMA tournaments generally, and they compare more to a modern fencing tournament than they do to a deed of arms proper. But because I think you'd see a different thing in a high-end deed of arms, you'll see that respect play out. But it's more a respect for peers, not for respect for place and authority. You do give that salute to whoever's running the field usually, just to kind of okay, this is your field. And if the marshals are representing that person on the field, then whatever they say does in fact go. But a respectful challenge would not be out of place there, whereas it might be in an Asian context. Because I think the sense of place in society is just different in those. How about you other guys? Have you seen it somewhere? All right, how about loyalty? Does that one come up at all? How would that one manifest?
Well, your friends, your family, people like that, stay true to them.
Okay, sure.
And that's, I had a guy who I was there for time and time again when he was, stepping stuff, and I was there for him. And then when it was my turn, he was like, "Oh well, majority rules, dude," And I remembered how that, that kind of reaction, what that did for me, and making a point that even when it's not comfortable, it's not popular, it still makes more sense to, you can still say somebody's wrong and be loyal to it, but you don't turn your back on it.
Okay, good.
I feel
What
like
else
it's
we got?
probably way different or I don't know, way different, but it's probably different for us than them because we're not like, I mean, if you talk about like Scola versus like what historically these like knights would have been subjected to, like we're not as like bound to our club, I guess, as a guy would have been back then. But there's still like, I mean, if a Scola guy was like at a tournament that I was at, and like I don't know him that well, and he's from across the country, like I still think we would all expect that somebody from within our club would like corner and coach them, and maybe like not be like coaching their opponent who maybe well or you see a lot as your buddy. So there's kind of like this team thing that maybe you could draw like a loose analogy to. I'm not sure how well it works, but I mean that's where I can get.
Sure, it works well enough. They, of course, had oaths of fealty and service to deal with. And sometimes those oaths, you'd have multiple ones. So let's say the guy that you're in service to is fighting on the other side, so you're really stuck. And these sides weren't really, there wasn't a nationalism the way we think of it. So a guy fighting on the English side wasn't always on the English side necessarily. His relatives might have been the aristocrats mixed, of course. So next week you might be on the other side facing the same people. So that helps to drive kind of that camaraderie of, yeah, I'm going to be pleasant to the people at my station across the field because A, I'm related to them, and B, next week you may be on the same side. So I think it played out a little bit differently. They also had an oath to the crown or whoever it is that they had to deal with as well. And sometimes those oaths conflicted. Like let's say there's a family loyalty conflicting with the one that they had going to the liege. That's a problem. And so a lot of the romance issues that you see in there are dealing with problems of loyalty. How do you handle these? Which means it was a significant problem for them. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so much examination of the issue. And there's all kinds of, fallout and conclusions that are reached based on different points of view. So I think this was a huge one for them. Courage obviously was an issue. You see it in a lot of the romances. Because, you know, having people come to battle, stand to your shoulder, and then not show up and not advance with you, well, that's a problem. And as David Grossman found in his book on killing, you know, guys fight in the trenches for the guy standing next to him, not for a big ideal. So it's pretty important the courage be in there as a thing. And then, of course, prowess weighs into that too. You want to know if the guy next to you is competent. I think Pressfield makes a really good case for this in his fictional, you know, Gates of Fire, looking at Thermopylae. Those sort of professional expectations are there. And we sort of expect that of our combatants too, of course. We expect them to be professional and exhibit the courage, you know, the ability to call blows, the ability to have express the other virtues for their opponents. We didn't go into the rest of them, but I heard largesse, which is the same as generosity, those out there. Certainly fidelity is one of those. There's different ways of defining that, but fidelity was in there. They would add faith, different ways of defining that today as well, but it's in there. And I think people would disagree necessarily on where some of these other ones came from. Humility is one that's in there sometimes. It depends on which ones you think are more important. The analogy I heard that I like is that it's like a string of beads. We all agree on which beads they are, but we string them differently according to which ones we think are important at that, you know, at that juncture in our lives. And I think that's Keen's model for that would kind of hold up. You would probably agree with that analogy if you heard it. So then he opens, after we're done with that, you know, you can go into Lull. Lull's a good thing to read, Raymond Lull's book of Knighthood and Chivalry at some point. It's pretty short, and it talks about each of the virtues as he sees it. He couches it in the Christian virtues, which is fine, but you can also expand on that slightly, because one thing that Keen's big on is this is not just an ecclesiastical idea. This is an idea that comes from secular warriors first and foremost, and the church modifies and adopts it to some degree, and they have a symbiotic relationship going back and forth. And then the court and the lady does her bit as well to modify it. So those are all aspects of it, and you can emphasize different ones depending upon where you stand on the spectrum. And then he gives, of course, 3 references. He talks about Lull a little bit. So like I said, I recommend reading that at some point if you get a chance. It's short, not as short as the Ordene, but it's short. And then he talks about the Ordene, and we'll talk about that one. And then he talks about Geoffrey Charnay, which we'll talk about later. All of which are useful sort of insights and windows into, and he takes those as 3 sort of emblematic ones. If you take these 3, this will give you a good idea of what the sort of spectrum was like then. So he'll introduce those. He introduces all 3 of those, which is nice. Danny, you might like Lull in particular because it's at least close to Spanish. So you guys can probably get their hands around something that's closer to a primary source that's Catalan. So you should be able to get closer on it. If you guys don't have a good Spanish version, let me know. I have one, so we can get it to you. Yeah, El Victorial, definitely. I've got that same edition. That's a good one as a biography. And there's a couple others in Spanish that are useful. So unfortunately, academically, the Spanish world is largely, like the German world, is a little bit walled off from the rest of academia. So there's a lot of stuff within the Spanish language discussed that doesn't ever make it into French or English. The same is true in German. It doesn't really get outside there. Whereas French, German, Italian kind of spill over and cross-publish and whatnot. It happens less in Spanish, unfortunately, and less in German. Probably for very different reasons in Spain than Germany, but nonetheless, it's true. Anything else you guys want to argue about that or talk about in the first little bit there? We'll probably push on the secular bits to next time because it's a whole nother chapter, whole nother way of doing it. How about the Ordene? What'd you guys think about that one? Hugh de Tabarry.
It was definitely tough to break into. That was an immediate observation. I'm probably gonna have to reread it because it's a little, it's old.
It is. And the composition on that one is old too. I didn't change it. It's 19th century, so it's flows like a 19th century piece, not like a 20th century piece might. I haven't seen a good 20th or 21st century translation of it. If I do, I'll bring it out, but I haven't seen that. It's actually much easier in French, but that doesn't help you guys. So translations are what they are. So yeah, it's a little bit hard to grapple with, certainly. Tom's cat obviously has an opinion on this.
Hey, kind of a weird question from that translation.
Sure.
I don't know why this like stuck out to me, but he talks about okay, so you know, putting on the white belt, I
Uh-huh.
guess, and that symbolizing, I think he said like purity, and it kind of
Right.
had, or but he also describes the coif as white, you know, which I think of like, you know, like heraldry, like white being like a metallic color.
Right.
Is that a weird translation, or I mean, what's going on there with the colors?
I think it's a cloth coif in linen probably. Underneath, it sits under the thing, because that's very common that people would wear that, much like you might wear a bandana today under your helmet or a mask or something to keep the sweat off and so on. Very common. You'll see a guy wear them today. They come down sort of over the ears and they got two little strings. High-end reenactors will wear them all the time. They look goofy as hell, but guys wear them. And I think that's what he's talking about. You could squint and say it's the silver of the male, but he mentions male in every other case. So I don't know why it would be there. It'd be different. So I think it's the linen coif he's talking about. Okay, so what's going on in the Ardennes? What's the point of the story?
Well, I gather that he got busted by Saladin and talks his way out of it.
It does. That's a notable thing in its own. So first of all, traditional practice from the classical era up to about the 11th century or so was to do what with prisoners?
Ransom.
Nope, not to that period. You enslave them usually up to that period. So, or kill them, one of the two. Pretty brutal. But that's, you know, if you're reading about the Persians coming across into Greece, they're enslaving all those guys. They're sending them back home as servants. So you get these noblemen transformed into servants. And some scholars, Peter Koss is one of these, arguing that one of the distinguishing points about chivalry is that you're no longer doing that. Now what you're doing is you're saying, okay, you're still my equal and peer, but I have captured you and there's a cost for that, so I'm going to ransom you. To the point where by the 13th century, they're sending people home with promises of payment instead of keeping them in prison or something. That's not always done, but it was sort of common practice. So that's a unique feature here. And of course, during the Crusades, the practice wasn't necessarily to send people home with a ransom. It was to capture them and put them in servitude and whatnot, at least in the early Crusades. Going both ways. But there was a lot of just killing of prisoners going on. So the fact that Hugh is captured and not killed by Saladin, he's already signaling that Saladin is not a what they might have called a barbarian or he's cultured, right? He's learned. He's a peer. It's just that he happens to be Muslim. And that's to the point where he evinces an interest in knighthood. What is this thing? And so that's why Hugh decides to take him through the process and knight him, which brings up, you know, any knight can make a knight. So, and this idea that we get of knighthood that's expressed in the Ardennes is not, everybody fighting in the medieval period was obviously not a knight. They're obviously the top in terms of the group. We'll talk about that more next time with the second chapter, but there were men at arms there as well, and there were footmen there also on the field who don't get mentioned hardly at all. But they weren't expected to adhere to the same standards. So what you're seeing in Hugh de Taberry here is a very interesting expression of what these things mean, and the fact that already in this early period, you've got a pretty solid expression of these ideals as ideals being put forward. So you mentioned the belt and the coif as, you know, meaning certain things. As he says in there, everything means something. Now, did the average soldier think that? Yeah, probably not. But this is the ideal that's overlaying the whole thing. So what sort of ideas come out of that whole process? I mean, you're seeing a civilizing of the world is what Peter Koss might call this. It's a little different than what was going on before. And thereby it's notable. What other ideas did you see in there? You can see it maybe in the equipment, but there's other things too.
I mean, he says he's supposed to use a sword to stick up for the poor people who can't stick up for themselves.
Okay, so the duty of defense for people who, who can't defend themselves, that's new. Now, it's not wholly new. If you would have talked to a member of a Greek phalanx, you would have said he's defending his polis, and only some of the people do that. But all male citizens in Greece were supposed to do that. That's why they were voting members of the citizenry, and others were not. So the other unique idea about that is they were the ones who voted themselves to war. They went. They didn't send other people. Very different. But still, you've got a lesser number of people doing that, and the sword is supposed to be used for justice. They would have agreed with that in Greece, I think. But you'd sometimes subjugate a city right next to you. And the Middle Ages is certainly not a period we can illuminate as being, a beacon of justice across the period. So the fact that this ideal is there is probably trying to fix a problem. It's saying, okay, well, often the sword isn't used for justice. So we need to change how this is being done. So a lot of these things I think you can look at in the negative and say, okay, what's actually going on here? What are they trying to fix? And this is why I say they're teaching texts. You sometimes have to look between the lines, but it's there. What else did you see? That was a good one, Marshall. What else did you see?
I found that the collé, the strike, was very interesting. The only time I saw that was in the movie Kingdom of Heaven,
Right.
where he strikes him after knighting him, so he doesn't forget the virtues.
Yeah, and it's in Raymond Lull also. And it's probably pretty traditional. We don't know because we don't have a lot of the data from a lot of the knighting ceremonies. But obviously in the 19th century, they made a big deal of this. But that became, in the 19th century, the dubbing with the sword. But that was not how it was done originally. The sword was belted on, and then you were thwacked. Most SCA knights take the adobement just like that. I mean, just the collé just like that. You're hit. Some days I can almost feel still the good whack. And you're supposed to feel it as a memory of these ideals are supposed to be imprinted on you. And so you take a good whack up to the face and say, never forget. And also the other part to that is let this blow never be the last one that goes unanswered. So there's another piece to that, saying you got to exhibit the courage, or if you map it back to the segno, of course, back to the leone, right? You're supposed to exhibit that as well. The collé, definitely. What else in there? How do these map to Schola things? The sword for justice and the collé. Any of that come back? And Sam, you brought up earlier, taking the blow. The collé is some of that, to some extent, both in terms of courage for calling the shot, but also you're just having the fortitude to take the blow. It does take courage to go out there, I would argue, whether you're in armor or out of armor. It takes courage to go out and get attacked with a sword. Even if it's a plastic sword, you're still, risking busted bones at the very least. So, does justice play into this thing at all in a Schola context? This one's harder.
I don't know. I mean, I think justice falls from a perspective of kind of going back to what we were talking about before. If you challenge someone that is far beneath your skill level, then the justice is going to be people are going to look down as you as like,
sure,
kind of, you're going to lose renown, right? They're going to look down at you as you're picking on this dude so that you can look good. Whereas the reverse is kind of true. So, I mean, it's less legal justice and more reputational justice, but I think it's still there.
Yeah, that's interesting. That brings up sort of, how you go after the new fighter, the new combatant. Because they obviously don't have the skills. They'll surprise the hell out of you because they'll do the unexpected things. So they're actually the most dangerous combatant in a lot of ways. But they don't have the refinement. And so how you treat them makes a great deal of difference. As you say, I think not only in the tournament field, but also just in practice, how you do it. Skola's got a pretty solid culture on that. So I'd be less worried about that, but it can show up. If you draw somebody new in a tournament, what do you do? How would you guys handle that, Marshall? Draw somebody brand new. It's your first pass.
I mean, Hopefully, I mean, I guess it just depends. I don't know. Like, you don't want to brutalize anybody for sure, and you don't want to make somebody not have fun in a thing where they're likely coming to it to have fun, you know. So I think ideally you would maximize your points in a way that doesn't humiliate them. Would be the goal, and then you know, after the fact, I would certainly want to talk to them.
Sure. And you want to avoid patronizing them. That's the other hard part. If you're not blowing them off the field, how do you not? And this can be a gender issue too sometimes. So
If I could say something on that,
please.
Without seeming like I'm sucking up, you are the perhaps best case I've ever seen of this, is the ability to reduce how hard you're fighting while not taking a blow, giving a person a good fight, and then ending it quickly. But they feel like they go away feeling like they've given it their all and put as much skill into it as they can, and they lasted for more than 2 seconds. And you have not just thrashed them off the field. And it's a fine balance, and it's something I've tried to replicate when I fight very new people. But that's how I mean, you're obviously the primary model I've seen on that, but the ability to ratchet back how hard you fight to kind of give them the ability to feel like they've achieved something without just taking them out immediately, and they're on the field less than a second.
I'll tell you where that comes from. I used to drive, there were 2 really skilled Dukes in the West who were just astounding. I mean, you know, orders of magnitude beyond other people when you'd fight him. It was just incredible. One of them, though, I always got the feeling that he was trying to push you out of the fight. Yeah, you don't matter. You're not here. And it's just sort of insulting in a way. It's like, yeah, this is really annoying. So I found myself at practice, whereas normally I would go for the toughest guy, I noticed that after 5 or 6 practices, I wasn't actually challenging him up early in the practice. I was waiting till later. I was like, well, that's really irritating. And then I tried to analyze why that was true. It's like, oh, because I feel like crap when I'm fighting him. So I made it my point to go fight him first every time thereafter, tried to get by that from my point of view. But it didn't change his attitude. It was still the same thing until the end. It was still annoying. I just found a way to deal with it. The other fellow, I think he was actually better, and I won a much lower percentage of fights with him. But it was glorious fun, and I pushed myself farther every time I fought him than I ever had before. So when I sat back and looked at those 2, it's like, which one do I want to be? It's like, well, I'd rather be the second one, obviously. So let's try to, what does that guy do differently? And when I asked him about it at a party one time, he said, I try to bring my opponent into the fight rather than pushing them out. And that's the way it felt to me with the other guy. He was trying to push you out of the fight. Like, you never had a stake in the fight. It wasn't yours. It was always all his. Whereas Radnor was like, no, it's a celebration between the 2 of us. Make no mistake, I'm going to win. But it's still a celebration between the 2 of you. And if you did hit him, he would take the blow. That was one of the differences. Whereas the other fellow, you'd hit him and you'd be like, I suppose I can give that one to you. It's like, oh, don't do me any favors, you know. So the attitude, the way they treated their opponents was very different, even though the physical prowess was probably very similar. And so I think we can try to be that person. The way that you want to be is you want to be the person in the PA who gets all the challenges, because that means you're fun to fight and challenging. And so that's a good sign. That's one of the reasons I like that mechanism in a PA. You can get that as a read. But it's not easy to do. You know, you find yourself being hit by novices in tournaments. Bam! Oh, nice shot. I will then ratchet up 1 step. Okay, excellent. Well done. Let's see if you can make the next step, and so on. And I've lost tournaments that way. I don't mind. It's fine. I have enough tournament victories. It really doesn't make any difference to me at all. And even if I didn't, there's not that much on the table. So it's not worth it to me. That also plays out to calling blows too. I'd much rather lose a fight to a blow I called that wasn't any good than to steal a fight by one that was good and I just blew through. So, and that happened one time. Came off the list. I had won the tournament without being hit, I thought. I was taking off my armor and one of my spalders had a giant crease in it, which wasn't there before. I was like, oh shit. Someone, somewhere during the day, laid that in there and I didn't feel it. So I took the spalders off. I never wore them again because I didn't want to rob the guy. And I do have a Globos breastplate, but anything that hits that, I go by sound. If it hits the breastplate and I didn't see it skip by, it's a fine shot. I don't care how hard it hit. Now your opponent will call it back sometimes. So I think this, Sam, you're hitting on something that does play out, how we approach the fights, what kind of combatant we want to be on the field, and what we want our renown to actually look like. That's what these underlying ideals, I think, are really trying to get at, is who do we want to be? And I think that this environment lets you actually sculpt that to some degree. At the same time, a good hard fight tests you to the core of your being. There's not a lot of room for hiding stuff. So all the insecurities are going to bubble up at that point. If the tournament's well run and the fighting is hard, there's really no place to hide. That's kind of what I talk about in the book of the tournament. There's no place to get around it. It just is what it is. That's why people who are really excited in this seek out those kind of tournaments, not just deeds of arms, but it can be in HEMA tournaments too. They want to test themselves and see what they're made of, both from a physical sense, but also from a character sense. I think both are important here. That's kind of the theme of doing these readings generally, is to sort of emphasize that, because we don't get much time at practice to talk about it. We should probably make more time, but this is really a core thing of what we do. We mostly get it by osmosis rather than this, but this is really where the study is at, I think. Okay, anything else you want to pull out of the Ordene to talk about? We're almost at an hour and a half now, so we'll fold it up here in a few.
Just to make sure that I because I said it was kind of a little bit of a tough read.
Sure.
So he refuses to knight Saladin, but Saladin asks him to knight him. Did I read this right? And what was his reasoning for not knighting him?
Not a Christian.
Okay, that's what I thought I got out of it. I thought that was kind of cool, because he definitely has like a conflict of interest. Like he wants to get out of this, but like the ideals of like his culture were so important to him, despite that he was willing to like uphold it.
Right. And then he finds a teaching opportunity, right? How can I influence Saladin? He's already noble. There's no question about that. But now how can he maybe he's not going to convert him to Christianity, obviously. But if he sees that there's resonance enough, then maybe this can soften things going forward, in addition to his own personal interest, which is there. I think the author's trying to do something pretty sophisticated here by suggesting that somebody on the other side of the Third Crusade might have the exact same ideas and follow a different deity or a different aspect of the deity.
That's also another good data point for the Keen argument of the secular origin, because like he's seeing this guy as like an equal, and like he's able to like learn about knighthood even though they're from like I doubt that the religious estate would have written it that way had it been their choice, instead of
yeah. Totally agree. And in fact, I guess I got a little taste of this when I was teaching some combatives in Afghanistan, of all places, with some soft guys. We're doing some counter knife stuff, which, Fiore's good on this stuff. So very helpful, even in that context. And totally different backgrounds, not religiously, but, coming at this from different points of view. And the camaraderie felt like, oh yeah, we're still combatants sitting right here, peers in this area at least. And they could outshoot me, no question, but, and take down a Kalat. But on this hand-to-hand stuff with the knife, we were equaling up. So it was like, okay, I think that prowess aspect, that argument Keen's making in here is pretty broad, and it will go somewhat beyond this. That extends to the warrior thing generally, but I think he's saying that even the other ideals that attach to it, which we didn't discuss much here, but Lowell's big on, those ideas are also, they're powerful and they resonate. So at the very least, he's trying to draw it all the way across. Not to say that everybody on the other side always has that, or that, the exegesis and the tone of war doesn't eclipse this. But in a lot of ways, these are a way to try to take war and turn it into something that's a little less completely devastating. It's still there, and it's never probably going away, but I think the Ordene is unique in that regard. You don't see that really expressed in any but one or two of the other obscure romances, something of that sort. And they're always going off to crusade. They're not trying to knight Saladin. So they're worthy opponents, but whether or not they're, they show the same values or not, that's not the most common idea in there. But as you say, I think Keen's saying it's deeper than that. It goes below even the religious level down to the warrior level. This is where kind of thinking about it in the different vectors from the warriors, from the church, and from the ladies is kind of helpful, because it does bring in different aspects of the thing. So Painter was, even though it's written in like 41, it's really a good book. It's very simple, actually. Compared to Keen, it's easier, but it also doesn't go into the depth. But if you want an easy one to maybe follow with Guy's Knight and Chivalry, Painter might be a good one if they want to read stuff like that. Especially if you have younger students. Painter is obviously very good and easier. It's called French Chivalry. It's very simple. You can find online copies probably for $5 or less. The reason we don't use it as the core here is because there's some other stuff in Keen that's helpful as we go deeper into this. He introduces Charnay and Lowell and all that. That's a lot of work done that, you know, our study group leaders probably can't introduce those guys independently or unless they do more reading. So it's tough to do. So Keen helps us with that. All right, anything else you guys want to throw in there from the Ordene? What did you think of it in general?
I'm gonna have to read it about 4 or 5 more times before everything sinks in.
Fortunately, it's short. I find something different to it every time I go back to it. All right. Well, so that hopefully, gives you a start on sort of how to look at this stuff and how to dig in. I would say for the next times, if we, talk about chapter 2 and 3 in Keen, that will probably be enough because there's a lot in that. You're talking about the secular orders and the religious side. That'll give us probably a good springboard off of this discussion we had about Saladin and the Ordene. And anything he mentions in there, if you're looking for auxiliary places to go, if you want to follow up on it, let me know and I can give you where the best version of that is or whatever, or the most accessible version is, if that's what you're after. If you want to do auxiliary stuff to catch up on it. The next 2 chapters take us up to the tournament chapters. So, so really it's page 63 or so. And then if you wanted to do the next one after that, it's also the dubbing chapter, which kind of ties back to this one. So I'll leave it up to you whether you guys want to do 2 or 3. It's up to you. You're muted still, Marshall.
Very good. If we do another full week like this, I mean, I think that 3 should be fine. But everybody kind of has their own schedule.
Liz, Daniel, Sam, what do you think?
For me, just 2.
Maybe we should keep 2. That way, some of these other guys who didn't make it this time can still catch up, not feel like pushed out of the group.
Yeah, this is designed just to sort of be helping them. So if they're, whichever ones they come in on, it'll help them on that one. And this will be recorded. So if they were interested in the other one, they can go back and get it. The other thing is there's nothing stopping this from going on in other realms, whether I'm involved or not. These are kind of discussions we should have all the time because this is the core of who we are. So, and this is what makes us a little bit different than some of the other approaches to this. Feel free. I mean, I don't have to approve or be involved or anything. You just dive in. It's fun.
This is awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I've got the Zoom room. So if I have a subscription, so if any of you need it, just let me know. And even if I can't be there, I'll set it up and you can use it. So it's fine. There's no reason to pay for this 3 times. So.
Thank you very much, everyone.
My pleasure, everybody. Well done. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Here's